Until 1945, the city of Nuremberg was essentially known for its magnificent architecture, an example of a late medieval historic center, with houses made of stones, masses, and wood, the streets paved with cobblestones, truly a small jewel of architecture. And then it was, and partly remains famous for a gastronomic peculiarity, the small flavored sausages of Nuremberg, a delicacy, such a delicacy that it even made, it is said, the great poet Goethe fall in love, who, always according to popular belief, would have even had them sent by mail. But from 1946 onwards, the city of Nuremberg took on another meaning in its name. In fact, the name of the city is ideally associated with a trial, even though there were far more than one. A trial carried out not so much to shed light on what had happened, but to assign responsibility for what had happened. A trial to ideally close a dark season, the worst season of Europe in contemporary times, the season of National Socialist madness, of Adolf Hitler's mad dream to dominate Europe with an iron fist, destroying entire civilizations, entire peoples, entire nations, enslaving them, making them servants of the great Germany, to thus close perhaps a more painful chapter, perhaps heavier to digest for the entire current era. The first question that everyone asks about the Nuremberg trial is, why hold it in Nuremberg? Why not elsewhere? Why not in Munich, the cradle of Nazism? Why not in Berlin, which after all was the capital of the Reich? Well, the choice of location was dictated by various issues. Firstly, at the time Nuremberg was in the American occupation sector, so it was easily accessible for all the victorious powers. Berlin, on the other hand, was almost entirely in the Soviet occupation zone, except for a small slice that would later become the core of Berlin. West, with the division of the two Germanys, then the Nuremberg Palace of Justice, attached to the prison, had survived the great bombings that had incinerated much of the historic center. And that Palace of Justice, in its size and layout, was ideal for conducting that trial. And not only that, in Nuremberg, the Nazi Party had celebrated the National Day of the party itself, one of the great oceanic rallies, with marches, parades, fanfare, flags, anthems. It was also a symbolic way to settle accounts with the past. That's why Nuremberg was chosen. And why then a trial? Well, the reasons for the trial began quite some time before, in the fall of 1943 at two separate summits, one in Moscow between the foreign ministers of the time, Cordell Hull, Anthony Eden, and Vyacheslav Molotov, and then the Tehran Conference. At the Tehran Conference, Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill begin to plan what will happen after the end of the war. They begin to discuss not only how to treat, for example, Italy, which has surrendered, with Stalin claiming the Italian fleet, and Churchill and Roosevelt opposing practically already a first Cold War friction, but also what to do with Nazi Germany, the Germans, the Nazis, how to behave with them. Stalin is intransigent in Tehran. At a certain point, during the gala dinner, he snubs Churchill, who gets up disgusted from the table and leaves, stating that he wants to shoot them all, from the first to the last. A massacre, an eye for an eye, the law of the cutter. As time evolves, Stalin will not only try to soften, but will be less drastic. He will accept a shared vision with the Western allies. We must prosecute, but prosecute not only to punish, prosecute to make it clear that what has happened must absolutely not be repeated. Because when the war ends in 1945, the nightmare that grips the Western allies, and partly also the Soviet Union, is that there could be a repetition, just as the mistakes made at Versailles in 1919 had led in the long term to the birth of European totalitarianisms, fascisms, Nazisms, and then to the outbreak of the Second World War, along with several linked events, errors of judgment. Well, they did not want to repeat the same risk, and they did not even want to run that risk. That's why it's necessary for the Allies to face the problem head-on, to confront the enemies, those who have been captured, those who have survived the war, during a series of trials. The main one, the one that essentially gives the name to the Nuremberg trial, we could define it as the trial of the hierarchs. It's a trial that involves many survivors of the war. There is also a defendant in absentia, Martin Bormann, because in 1946 there is no news of him. He disappeared from Berlin during the final battle days at the end of April 1945. Nothing is known about him. It is said that he has fled who knows where. It will take a few decades to shed light on his case, to clarify how, in reality, Martin Bormann had died in the meantime. At the time, it was unknown. Martin Bormann, judged in absentia and condemned, is included in the list. The main perpetrators of the Nazi regime are charged with 4 counts: conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, planning, initiating, and waging wars of pure aggression, committing war crimes, committing crimes against humanity. Only Bormann is not at the dock. Hitler is missing, who committed suicide. Goebbels is missing, who also committed suicide with his wife after killing all their children. Himmler is missing, who after being captured by the Allies, preferred to commit suicide shortly thereafter. Other key figures are missing. Of course, Reinhard Heydrich is missing, who died from the injuries sustained in the Prague assassination attempt in the early summer of 1942. Some key figures, such as Adolf Eichmann, are missing from the Wannsee Conference. Heinrich Müller, the Gestapo chief, is also absent, vanished without a trace. Josef Menger is not there either, escaped like Eichmann and many others to South America. This trial is not a trial that begins simply. First of all, the composition of the court itself. Each winning nation is called upon to express a judge and his procedural substitute. There are also disputes about the judges, as well as about the American Chief Prosecutor Robert Howard Jackson, but they are overcome over time. What instead raises perplexity is which code to adopt, because like every trial, lawyers know it is necessary to understand on what legal basis to found not only the charges, but also the procedure and possibly the measure of the penalties to be culminated. The defense, for example, of one of the main defendants, Göring, invokes a principle, nullum crime, nulla pena, sine previa legge penali. What does all this mean? It means that a defendant cannot be judged based on laws enacted after the actions he has committed. So laws that concern the past, retroactive laws. In practice, it was contested the ability of the winners to judge the losers, as if it were a law of retaliation or a law of ancient Rome. Then there is still a law of the barbarian populations. This detail is overcome because after all those contested crimes, it is true that they were not provided for by German laws, but they were provided for by international conventions. Certainly some of these not recognized by Nazi Germany, by fascist Italy rather than by Imperial Japan, but in force and accepted by the international community. Think of the Hague Convention or the Geneva Conventions, the lack of respect for prisoners of war, the fair treatment of them, the indiscriminate bombings on the civilian population or on hospitals. All this could not be accepted within a logic of war, not even the most ruthless. For all this, one must pay. Then clearly comes the ultimate issue, say racial persecution, extermination camps, segregations, the Einsatzkommando, which will then be dealt with in a separate trial. Well, this process that unfolds over a year encounters many obstacles along its path. Jurists have long discussed and debated whether the legal foundations of the Nuremberg trials were sufficiently solid. There was also a case, the case of a very famous jurist, Hans Kelsen, who, while declaring himself in favor of a court reckoning with the Nazi monsters, doubted the soundness and validity of the trial itself due to the absence of third-party judges or judges from the defeated nations. Kelsen, for example, observed that to be a truly fair international tribunal, it would have had to compose a kaleidoscope of nations and jurists in such a way as to be substantially unassailable, even at the cost of taking more time to reach final decisions. In such a case, Kelsen objected no one could even raise a finger to contest the Nuremberg verdict because it would not have been the result of the will of the victors, over the winds, but of a collective will, including that of Germany itself, of those Germans who had had to endure 12 years of Nazi heel and who would finally have been able to contest from a legal point of view all the distortions, all the horrors, all the violence that the regime had been capable of. Against these observations, others have been made observations that have pointed out how essentially in no case could a jury be called neutral or all-encompassing. We could almost call it global or worldwide. After all, a fair trial was assured. Every defendant had a defense team composed not only of German lawyers, but also of Allied lawyers. They requested fairness, not neutrality. Neutrality means having no stance, while fairness is a different concept. Fairness is knowing how to weigh the evidence, the testimonies, the responsibilities, and the punishment. And this is what happened in Nuremberg. The defendants were weighed, not on their body weight, but for what they had said and done. But let's take a look at these defendants. Without Hitler, without Himmler, without Goebbels, it is clear that the first defendant, the most important of all, was him. The Reich Marshal, Hermann Göring, dismissed, arrested by Hitler just a few days before the fall of Berlin, because Göring had tried to undermine him, or at least to take power himself. The SS execution squad had not shot him. They had arrested him, but after a while they had let him go. Göring had been captured and taken to jail. Göring is also the first to be found guilty on all 4 counts. But Göring is also one of the few defendants to escape conviction. Not because he was pardoned, not because his sentence was commuted, but because he managed to commit suicide in his cell with a cyanide capsule. Some say it was introduced by one of his lovers with a kiss. Others say it was brought by a corrupt guard soldier. Many hypotheses exist, but one certainty is that Göring did not face the gallows. Then there's Joachim von Ribbentrop, and there's already so much to say about that. Maybe one day we'll talk about it. Foreign Minister of the Reich. And even before that, Ambassador to London. He too found guilty on all 4 counts. He is particularly burdened by that infamous pact with Molotov, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 1939, the pact between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union of non-aggression, and the partition of Poland. Alfred Rosenberg was hanged on October 16th, 1946. We will talk about him in detail in a subsequent video, ideologue of the Nazi Party, and recognized as the author of the worst racist theories on which the regime was based. He had been appointed Reich protector of the occupied territories in the East, practically the minister responsible for the occupation of those territories that had been conquered in Poland and then subsequently in Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, in the Ostrand, that is the Baltic states. He too was hanged October 16, 1946. Then a high-ranking military officer, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, head of the Oberkommando of the Berla. He too, all 4 charges are contested, he too guilty 4 times. Compared to the other defendants and those before him, he asks for a punishment different from hanging. He sees himself as a soldier, accepts his duties, and asks to be shot. Request denied. He was also hanged October 16, 1946. Another officer, Alfred Jodl, another general, chief of staff of the Oberkommando. We must make a note about Jodl. He too is found guilty of all charges. 7 years after his death, he is posthumously acquitted by a German court that applies international law and indeed judges him not guilty. However, the verdict is soon overturned by the Minister of Political Liberation of Bavaria. He was also hanged on October 16, 1946. And on October 16, 1946, many climbed the gallows. Wilhelm Frick, Hitler's interior minister, guilty of 3 of the 4 charges, goes up, as does Artus Seyss-Inquart, an Austrian, one of those responsible for Austria's Auschwitz, as well as being Reichskommissar in the Netherlands. And then Fritz Sauckel, the one responsible for reducing war prisoners and foreign workers to slavery. Sauckel even professes innocence, says he is not responsible for anything, that the sentence is wrong. But how can one call the sentence wrong that concerns the enslavement of human beings? Then it's Hans Frank's turn, the head of the General Governorate, practically the minister for the occupation of Poland. It must be said that Frank is one of the few to express a glimmer of remorse during the trial. He releases statements in which he admits some responsibility, admits to having known certain things and not having done anything. He seeks forgiveness, but is still executed by hanging. As Bormann stated, he does not face the gallows himself, and the reason is clear. We've already discussed Kaltenbrunner in a previous video on the channel. He, too, was first in charge of the Einsatzgruppen in the occupied Soviet Union, then head of the Reichssicherheitshauptamt in replacement of Heydrich after his death. The aberrant thing about Kaltenbrunner is that, as a jurist, a former lawyer, he calls Rudolphus, former head of the concentration camp, or rather the extermination camp of Auschwitz, to defend him. The devil being defended by another devil. Even more annoying as a character, and especially as a statement, is Julius Streicher, a journalist, director of a magazine, Der Stürmer, a very racist, anti-Semitic, vulgar, offensive, supremacist newspaper. He is found guilty of only one charge, the fourth is crimes against humanity. Even today, flipping through just one copy of Der Stürmer would make it clear what Streicher was publishing. Then it's Robert Ley's turn. He was the head of the Deutsche Arbeiter Front, the German Workers' Front, or rather the single union of workers. He doesn't make it to the verdict. He also kills himself before, much earlier. If Goering commits suicide just before going to the gallows, he kills himself in his cell on October 15, 1945. It is not known whether he did it out of shame, to escape the trial, or because he regretted what had happened. After the death sentences conclude, the life sentences are handed down. The first to be sentenced to life imprisonment is Rudolf Hess, Hitler's former protege who had flown to Scotland, somewhat surprisingly, in the early course of the war to negotiate a peace with the Allies or to offer an alternative solution. We have already discussed this in the monograph dedicated to him. Hess is sentenced to life imprisonment to be served in Spandau Prison, a fortress prison, and there he will die many, many years later. When he dies, he will be the last Nuremberg convict to see his sentence carried out. Then come Erich Raeder and Walter Funk. Life imprisonment for them too. The king of the Kriegsmarine's Grand Admiral had been judged as responsible for the German naval rearmament, a rearmament that was not supposed to happen, but he is pardoned after a few years for health reasons. Funk, the Minister of Economy of the Nazi government, had been Hjalmar Schacht's successor as president of the Reichsbank. He also receives a life sentence but is pardoned in 1956 due to health issues. Then come the lesser sentences. Albert Speer, Hitler's favorite architect, who was responsible for the model projects for the restructuring of the 1,000-year Reich for the new enormous Berlin, the capital of a huge Germany, the man who was also put in charge by Hitler of the armament production system, is sentenced to 20 years. Like him, Baldur von Schirach, already a diplomat and head of the Italian youth. Von Schirach also admits part of his own responsibilities and tries to repent. This may be why he only receives a 20-year sentence. 15 years in prison for Konstantin von Neura, foreign minister until he was ousted by Fori Ribbentrop, and then governor of the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, and here too, replaced by the bloodthirsty Adri. 15 years because between the oustings and a fight with Hitler that had led to his resignation from all positions, he had managed to lighten some of his own position. However, he was released well before the end of the sentence in 1954. We come to the big Admiral Karl Dönitz. We have dedicated a monograph to him, the father of indiscriminate submarine warfare, the father of U-Boot, and not only the last president of the Reich in its very last days in the Flensburg government. Dönitz is sentenced to 10 years, but his sentence causes scandal because after all what he did, the indiscriminate submarine warfare is exactly what the United States did in the Pacific with those submarines. And then there is a methodological but also moral and jurisprudential doubt. How correct is it to recognize a penalty for a crime if the nation that imposes that penalty has used the same methods? It's a question that continues even today and has not yet been dispelled. Then come the acquittals because someone is acquitted in Nuremberg. Hans Frisch, Goebbels' deputy at the Ministry of Propaganda, is acquitted. He too repents, and perhaps this plays in his favor. Franz von Papen, who played a role in Hitler's rise, is acquitted. He soon realized that he had made a terrible mistake in favoring the rise of the former Austrian corporal. He, who was briefly chancellor and then vice, had repeatedly criticized the work of the Nazis and had been out of the scene for quite some time. If in Nuremberg, the Spange, a German court, will initially sentence him to 8 years of forced labor, only to acquit him on appeal in 1949. Then it's Yelmarschak's turn. He too is acquitted. He had been president of the Reich Bank until the start of the war. Then he was removed from his position, and in the last period, he had become one of the Reich's prominent hostages. One of the hostages who had been freed at Lake Braise in South Tyrol. Even in his case, it was never understood how much he was complicit in Nazism and how much he was merely an executor, his occupier, hostage, or even victim. It remains a question. In the case of Gustav Krupp von Bohlen and Albach, it is decided not to proceed. He is not prosecuted at all for health reasons. He is elderly, has his place, his son pays, sentenced to 12 years in prison. This is the Nuremberg trial. But it doesn't end here. There are another 12 trials that continue until 1949, and these are trials that concern various German and Nazi activities during the war. There is the doctor's trial, for example, on medical experiments, which surprisingly sees many solutions, because in some cases it is understood how the doctors did not know or were not aware of certain dynamics and were convinced they were acting only in the name of humanity to save lives, not to end them. There is the trial called the hostage trial, even though it's not exactly like that. It's a trial for all those soldiers who in the Balkans destroyed villages, razed them to the ground, terrorized the population, and took hostages. A trial that sees in the front line numerous officers of Austrian extraction, like Lothar Rendulic. It's a trial that reveals the worst atrocities of war. The trial of the Einsatzgruppen, of all the surviving members of the war, of those death squads that had terrorized the occupied Soviet Union, mass killing Jews, Romani, Sinti, people's commissioners, opponents, sometimes even prisoners of war. There is the so-called Prupp trial, the trial of the industrialists, and together with the trial of IG Farber, the large chemical factory that had produced Zyklon B, the deadly gas used in the extermination camps. The Nuremberg trials are numerous, leaving one to ponder if it's truly the end, not only in Nuremberg, but also in Tokyo and Rome. In Tokyo, there was another trial, we have already said, a trial against Hideki Dojo in the political class of the Rising Sun. It's a different trial from Nuremberg, a trial that does not see Emperor Hirohito on the dock, who essentially, admitting Japan's defeat, saves the Japanese imperial monarchy, but renouncing the mystical side, the spiritual side, the religious side, but does not save the entire political military caste that had ruled Japan, trying to make it a sort of offshoot or repetition in the east of social action. Instead, a trial does not take place in Rome. Why? Winston Churchill will say that Mussolini's death and the disappearance of fascism prevented the holding of an Italian Nuremberg. Churchill's words are partly true, but they are also partly opportunistic. There was no Italian Nuremberg for many reasons. One of these is the fact that several former fascist officials were necessary in the not so much material as institutional reconstruction of Italy after the Second World War. In other cases, the revenges, the settling of scores, the atrocities committed at the end of the war or immediately after the end of the war by some partisan formations made people doubt the legality of what had happened. In some cases, the revenges had equaled or surpassed the brutality of the murderers. This is the reason why, concurrently with the launch of the new Republican Constitution, launched in December 1947 and put into operation on January 1st, 1948, a general amnesty was proposed and approved precisely to settle the accounts. We could say it in Roman Italian, let's love each other. It wasn't exactly like that. It erased everything that existed on both sides with a single stroke of the sponge. There would be much more to say, for example, about the figure of certain generals claimed by Ethiopia or Yugoslavia or Greece as war criminals. Italian generals who had committed horrible crimes or who had given orders we could really judge beyond the limit were not handed over. Even in this case, a logic prevailed. the one that will be called the Yalta logic, the logic of the now imminent or already realized division of the world into two opposing blocks, East and West. A world that needed in Italy, but also in other countries, to reuse, not to say even recycle, the old soldiers, the old generals of the dark period of the fascist period, were useful in a new world, a different world, but in part similar to the previous one, a world in which there was no longer a tyranny to fight on a global level, but in which interests were divided into opposing poles. But this is another story.